Okay, the spots. I hope I made it clear. I think there's a better world coming, but we're going through some bad years now. And exactly when it happens doesn't matter much, but you should prepare as peace people for the future. Not only for the despair and critical situation we're in now, but you should spend 80% of your energy on discussing what the world should be like after the US empire and NATO has gone down. Syria. There are 2 good articles written about Syria as far as I've come across. I'm not an expert on Syria. I've only passed through Syria on my way to Iraq before the Iraq war, so I'm not an expert at all. But there are 2 good articles that I've learned more from than anybody else's articles. And certainly I don't read the media in the West to know what's going on in Syria. One is written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which starts out, his father was killed by an Arab and he's been interested in the Arab world since then, and he's written a brilliant article. He's an environmentalist. A brilliant article on why Syria started by CIA arriving in Syria in 1949. And then he builds it back and says, this is where we are today. It is about a pipeline of gas and oil that the US wanted at the time and onwards to go through all of Syria and drop out the oil and the gas in Turkey. And old Assad and young Assad said no. The latter mentioned did it in 2009, and from that on, they said this man must go. And they could use the Arab Spring as a pretext. I'm not in doubt that he murdered a few people. I'm not in doubt that he's a dictator, and he's not a pleasant guy, although he's a doctor from England, and didn't want to become a politician. Only got it because his brother was destined to be the politician. But I'm quite sure, with the conflicts I've been involved in over the years, that there's no way you can explain such a conflict by reference to one single person. Like Iraq was not about Saddam Hussein only, or Libya was not only about Gaddafi, or Yugoslavia or Serbia was not only about Milosevic. And what you see is that when they have left the office, things are getting worse. This idea, if we take him out, everything will be fine. They have learned absolutely nothing of all the former failures. Where is things better in Iraq after Saddam Hussein? Excuse me, I was there when he was there. I spoke with his closest people. Had long 6-hour interviews with Tariq Aziz. It was a good society in many ways. Yes, not a democracy, but compare with today's Iraq. Hoo-hoo. Look at Libya. Why did it happen? Because the Americans and Anders Fogh Rasmussen went way beyond the legitimate mandate they had from the Security Council, which was to set up a no-fly zone, which is, by the way, a violation of international law, and go for regime change and mass destruction of the city. It was Danish F-16s that destroyed his palace and killed his grandchild in Libya. Not something to be proud of, Mrs. Thorning-Smith. But then she went to save the children, and that's a good idea. Maybe she got wiser. Syria is about oil and gas, hugely complex ethnic, political, historical things. And it is, and that's the second article by the American diplomat Polk, or Polk, whatever his name is to be pronounced, which emphasizes that the whole thing started later on in the late, 2010 or something like that, with a huge drought. Most of Syria, no rain for 5 or 6 years. People flocking to cities, getting tension and everything falling apart. And the tension mobilizing also against the regime. Then came the Arab Spring and there was a confrontation. I don't know how many CIA people were there among the Arab Spring people, but certainly there was somebody there monitoring all this and seeing to it happen like in Kiev. But the long story short is, it has nothing to do with what you're told. And therefore it's so utterly stupid of the Americans and others to insist that there can be no deal and no peace in Syria unless Assad is out. Who are we to decide that? They have so far yet to have one negotiation anywhere in the world in which the Syrian civil society is represented as active negotiators and not as observers. Who sits at the table in Geneva? Now, the greatest respect from Mr. Mistura, and for Kofi Annan earlier, and for al-Baradei and all the others who've broken their neck on this. There can only be a solution with Assad. And then maybe a transition to something else. I said that at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2011. at a meeting called by the foreign minister, Willy Søvndal. And I said a few other things that nobody listened to, and that's where we are today. I said, don't pump weapons into Syria. Don't become a member of Friends of Syria. Don't support all these that you think are moderates. I mean, I knew this from other conflicts. I'd seen it elsewhere, and they did exactly the same thing again, and that is where we are now. What is it? 300,000 people killed, 4 or 5 million refugees, people coming into Europe. All this could have been avoided. All this could have been avoided. I repeat, it is not necessary to deal with things this way. If you have a problem, solve the problem. If you have a problem and you weaponize a conflict to that extent, you're going to have 10 times more difficult problems to solve. When you've begun to kill hundreds of thousands of people and children, etc., it's getting much more difficult to solve a conflict with the original things that you had as a conflict with each other. Now, this is banal. I'm getting tired of hearing myself saying such banal things. But it's obviously very advanced thinking for the average politician, who absolutely learns nothing from former mistakes. There's no institutional learning. There's no lessons learned unit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. We are going happily into doing exactly what we've done before. Why do we do it? There's one reason: the US has asked us to it. There's no other reason for Denmark to bomb in Syria. No interest, no economics, nothing. Well, maybe testing some planes and some pilots, I don't know. But the only reason we basically do it, which is counterproductive to the security of the Danish people in the future, because it'll lead to more terrorism and terror risk for the Danish people. And I condemn a government that is more loyal with a foreign power than with its own people. And so should other Danes. Okay, Ukraine, they basically disappeared. The ceasefire there is not working, but it's still okay, according to the OSCE, who is there monitoring it. What was it about? It was about roughly 25 years of mismanagement in the West after the Cold War's dissolution, after the wall came down, after the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact disappeared. What should we have done? We should, of course, have closed down NATO. Obviously. I said it at the time, and I say it today. We made a huge mistake of using the weakness and the being on knees of Russia because their system failed. We used the triumphalist. We won the Cold War. There you see, these lousy guys lost. You see, that they lost does not mean that we won. It's a typical dichotomy in the Western banal thinking. There might be a fourfold table saying maybe they win in the long run because they cut their empire. Maybe we will lose in the long run because we have not cut our empire and our militarism. So what did you do? You promised Gorbachev to not expand NATO and not have a unified Germany in NATO. James Baker said it. George Bush stood in the Ukraine parliament in December 1990 and said, we do not want an independent Ukraine. We are afraid of the nationalism and the racism here. The old Bush, not the George W., but the old CIA Bush, who knew something about the world in contrast to his son. Hans-Dietrich Genscher just died recently. The man who's done, is celebrated everywhere, but he was the reason Yugoslavia fell apart into war in Bosnia. I know the story from inside. Through hour-long discussions with the German ambassador in Yugoslavia at the time, who was tearing out his hair saying, this man doesn't listen to anybody but himself, and he recognized Slovenia and Croatia, got the EU to do the same, and released the war in Bosnia, for which the EU got the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was also saying, no NATO expansion. Who flunked all these? Who broke the promises? Bill Clinton, the husband of the presumably future president. I know everything about it because I sat in Tbilisi, Georgia in 1994 with the American representative who said this is the future NATO. Georgia, not Georgia in the US, but Georgia, down there. And they crept in everywhere in former Yugoslav republics, advisors from Pentagon and State Department, sometimes in uniform. And they all prepared the expansion of NATO. Now, where did it end? It ended in Kiev. At some point, Russia has to say, we have a security border. We have a near to protect. We don't want NATO to be right up under our skirts. And unfortunately or fortunately, Ukraine can never become a member of NATO, and you better recognize it. Hardline guys like Brzezinski and Kissinger knows these things, and I'm in agreement with them. Make it neutral, make both parties, East and West, use and help Ukraine. Ukraine, which today has an economic situation that is the same as Iraq's economy after all these wars and 13 years of sanctions. You have no idea how poor Ukraine is. Now, it doesn't mean that it was right of Putin to annex Crimea, but it's a small crime compared with Kosovo and a few other things the West has done, including the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which they would never have dared do if there was a Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact. That would have started World War III. Undoubtedly. It was a totally sensitive area, but the West could go in and do these things in Yugoslavia because they couldn't do anything in Moscow. So where are we today? We are having a Russia whose military expenditures are 11% of the US and 7 or 8% of NATO. Now, you tell me seriously that that is a threat to the West. You tell me seriously that Putin is going to invade and occupy Copenhagen one of these days? Or Stockholm, which is now trying to become a member of NATO, with a host nation support agreement and all kinds of stealth integration with NATO behind the backs of the Swedish people? No. I don't think he is mentally ill, and I don't think he is suicidal. You can sleep well at night. But you need that type of bullshit from the Danish defense minister, for instance, and the Danish government, and the supporting parties, even from Holger K. Nielsen, Politiken 2 days ago, telling us that Russia is a terribly and aggressive power. I've listened to this for basically 60 years. I was a child during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I haven't seen them coming for all these years. And if I use my intellect and my facts and the history of it, there is no reason to be afraid that Russia will, out of the blue and unprovoked, invade a NATO country. Or Sweden, which is informally NATO. Forget about it. These threats are constructed to legitimate the purchase of, new fighter aircrafts in Denmark and pre-positioning material in Eastern Europe. Tons of exercises, very dangerous exercises. You have this General Breedlove in NATO, the highest NATO guy in Europe. Look at his ways, look at his eyes, listen to what he says, and then see the Dr. Strangelove film. There's no rationality anymore. There is no analysis anymore. There's no balancing factors anymore. There is just left one thing, and that is propaganda to make you fear. And the term for that in political science is fearology. If you make people fear terrorism, fear Russia, fear God knows what, you can make people believe in whatever and accept that you limit their freedoms, you take their money for new weapon systems and all these things. It's doable. If you don't stand up and say, I am not afraid. I do not buy this BS. You are living in a world in which propaganda, market stuff, communication information is much more important than knowledge and facts. And you've got to look up because you're paying the price. 5,600 per man, woman, and child in Denmark for the new planes, just to buy them. Then you have 30 years of maintaining them and using them. That's another 70, 80 billion Danish kroner. It's the largest investment in Denmark's history. And they're telling us, goddammit, that creates workplaces, gives employment to 10,000 people in Denmark. Excuse me, if we invested this in civilian things, you would probably get 50 or 100,000 new workplaces. The worst way in which you can create employment is through military production because it's capital intensive and not human intensive. Put the same money into schools and culture and all that. 1, you'll have a better society. 2, you will not have any enemies because you're not threatening anyone. 3, you'll get tons of more better economy because you put it into human beings, nurses, teachers, what have you. And they will become consumers and you will have the wheels turning again. It's a total economic waste to have military production. Except for the few corporations that get the contract. For the Danish economy, for the American economy, for the British economy, it's negative for the country to have military production. But you're being seduced because they say it to you. You hear it again and again. And now, goddammit, they have posters all over Denmark telling you that you should have something called a Hornet fighter aircraft because it has killed so many people the last 10 years. We know what we're talking about, whereas the F-35 is well known if you go through the international military press that it's a disaster. It's not even tested yet. If you go to American newspapers, in military specialized newspapers, you'll find out that it has tons of problems. Among other things, that its electronics gets so hot that you have to open parts of the body of the flight to have it cooled. And what happens when you do that? This is according to military technology magazines. And if you want the source, it's the man who checks technology for the Australian defense. And he said, this is crap. Don't buy it. Because when you open that to cool the electronics inside it, it is no longer a stealth plane. If you know what a stealth is, it's a plane which can go through without being seen on radars, meaning it's going to be used for offensive purposes, because that is not a problem if you only have it for defense when somebody attacks your country. But the moment you open that one, it can be seen on a radar. So it will reveal its existence because of its lousy technology. Now, I'm not a technician. I'm just giving you what I can read, and everybody in this room can read on the net. And this is a plane Denmark, allegedly, according to sources yesterday at Radio 24/7, has decided that that is the one we shall buy. We shall not have this crap. We don't need it. It cannot defend Denmark. It can only be used for intervention. Put that money after refugees. Make society a good society for everyone. Be generous. And know everybody will love you, instead of a Denmark that everybody will begin to hate. There will be a lot of hatred turned against Europe in the future if we continue the way we do now. The refugees I have talked about, I see the refugees today as the world's most important nonviolent movement. If we can help each other promote the simple view, the slogan I use, which is the following: behind every refugee stands an arms trader. If we can make that connection clear in people's minds, that the refugees come because we have destroyed their societies for no good reason, this could be a huge nonviolent movement against war, and a wake-up process for Danes and others in Europe. If we accept that refugees are terrible and they should be turned off and closed borders and all that, the Europe we know will fall apart. And we will have more warfare, more terrorism, more cynicism, more racism. And God forbid that is the way Europe goes. It's not necessary for us to go that way. And then Iran, I'm just saying the following about Iran. It would be wonderful if the United States of America could have as much democratic change in the right direction as the so-called dictatorship in Iran has had the last few years in the right direction. I worked there. I'm totally fascinated by the country, the people, not by the theocracy, but with the people, the culture, the decency, the enormous cultural creativity, and the stability of the country. There's no terrorism. It's a country that for more than 200 years has not invaded anyone. Who can you say that about among our allies? It's a country whose military expenditures are lower than Israel, although it has 10 times more inhabitants, 10 times, more than 10 times larger territory to defend, and has no nuclear weapons, as we all know. One of the things that has happened since I was here last is that we have this marvelous agreement for Iran not to get nuclear weapons. Parentheses, because they didn't want to, in my view, but that's another thing. But you had a brilliant diplomat, the foreign minister and the president, who negotiated this against 6 opponents, of which 5 themselves had nuclear weapons. Germany was the only one who was clean hands, but they have nuclear weapons from the US in Germany, but not German nuclear weapons. Now that gives me hope, and my future vision for Iran, which I discuss with the Iranians when I'm there, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, intellectuals, university lecturers and all that, is Iran as the future Switzerland of the Middle East. A place you meet. Why must everybody go to Switzerland? That's a nice place, but could be 2 places in the world you go. And secondly, this is a country that has a right to self-defense. I'm not an advocate of military defense, but they have a right to have missiles. They have a right to have, according to the UN Charter, Article 51, a right to self-defense. And everybody now are ganging up against Iran. Look at the fact that Saudi Arabia today is the world's third largest military power. It's bigger than Russia. Look at why they have created, or are about to create, a new army of 100,000 people together with the Gulf states. Look at the new interesting alliance of Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, ISIS, and Israel. Mark my words, that's the new alliance. Saudi Arabia and Israel are leaving the US and don't believe in the support of the US, and they have huge problems because of Netanyahu, not because of Obama. Look at who has a common interest. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Turkey also, to a certain extent, although it's a NATO country, that's problematic. Israel and ISIS. First two letters in Israel is IS. Now you think I'm joking. What do they have in common? An enormous investment in military and an enormous hatred of Iran. And at some point they will gang up and start a war on Iran. I know which side I will be on at that day. And it's time you guys go to Iran. Try to see what it's like yourself. Put the perspective of human rights repression, which is obvious, into the perspective of the good sides of Iran. I'm very happy I've started working there and I have some sense of it. Because it confirms, again, my own experience from 40 years. Wherever you go to a country that is negatively monitored in the Western press, it has something interesting to teach you. And the image you have nothing to do with the reality. And it's written by people in the Western news bureaus and others who have hardly been there, which applied also to former Yugoslavia. So, keep an eye on Iran. It's not the policies against the women that I'm fascinated by. By the way, the women are getting on quite well because they have very good strategies for combating this stupid repression. There are 3 or 4 layers in the Iranian society, and there are discos and naked parties and booze and liquor and everything else. It's quite fascinating, double standard. People survive. Go to the desert and drink your liquor. I've done it myself, it's quite fascinating. Discos in buses when the police is not there and things like that. Fascinating. Much more creative than a normal welfare state, boring welfare state like Denmark. So you can get on like this. But for those of you who are Danes, let me just say Denmark is in deep crisis, and it's a moral crisis. You can make such a decision 2 weeks ago without having any opposition or debate, left or right. When ministers and others stand up and say, we've got to eradicate them, we've got to kill every one of them, and there's nobody who says, excuse me, is it okay to kill? For what reasons can we mass kill people in the Middle East who are innocent and not parties to the conflict? Are we not then the terrorists that we are fighting? Because what is the definition of terrorism? It is to kill innocent people, to instill fear, to kill or maim or harm people who are not party to a conflict. I mean, soldiers killing soldiers is not terrorism, that's war. Terrorism is to kill innocent people deliberately, to instill fear. That's what Denmark does. And I stand for the view and the words that those who have nuclear weapons are adhering to terrorist philosophy, because you can't use them without killing a hell of a lot of civilians, and those who bomb, and according to the Danish Defense Minister, Mr. Christensen, has a right to kill civilians in Syria and Iraq if the military object so motivates. As long as it is in proportion to the military gain, you are welcome, or you can accept killing of civilians. That is a terrorist philosophy. And I'm ashamed of a Denmark that subscribes to it. And I'm ashamed of a Denmark in which those parties who used, when I was young, to be critical of the military and armament, and that is the radical left, which is not left, the Radikale Venstre, the Social Democrat, at least parts of them, although they've always been good NATO stooks, but there was nobody who in the 80s would have said in Denmark that Denmark should go out and bomb innocent people. I sat in the Danish Commission for Disarmament and Security at that time as an expert. All through the 80s, 10 years, there was never anyone military, civilian, politician, advisor, anyone would never talk that Denmark should go and bomb and now also kill innocent people deliberately if its military gain is proportional to it. You guys in Denmark have something to begin to discuss, because not even that party, or Socialistisk Folkeparti, or a number of people in Enhedslisten have any problems with killing and using military. And those of us who think that peace is better than war are now a minority that has no representative in the Danish parliament. That's something to think about. Not that there's some idiot saying these things, but that it is not discussed. It doesn't ring the alarm bell. It doesn't motivate a journalist to call up and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Defense Minister, what did you actually say?" He probably doesn't know what he says because he's educated as an electrician. And that's fine with me. I'm nothing to... Maybe not he has the right capacity to do international politics and decide morally when to bomb and kill innocent people and when not to do it. I'm, as far as I know, the only intellectual academic in Denmark who's written articles after article not to accept bombing of innocent people, and that it is a fraud and fake presentation of international law. We do not have such a right. And I'd hope that somebody in the parliament, Danish parliament would have said so. We are now a rogue state adhering to a terrorist philosophy. You can quote me on that. I stand for it, and the intellectual, conceptual background for saying so is in order. Which it is not in the Danish parliament.